Science for Everyday Decisions, series by Center for Sustainable Development at the Earth Institute, Columbia University. For your consideration for a more sustainable life through education for sustainable development.
Hello everybody, this is Radhika Iyengar from the Center for Sustainable Development. We are doing these podcasts as a part of our Eco Ambassadors program, where there are two main objectives of the program. One is educating people on the science of sustainability. So basically, how can we use science to inform our day-to-day decision making in our lifestyles and changing it to become more environment friendly? And the second component is we try to make people more aware about their environment and promote them to be eco-activists. How can they take the initiative to become the change makers in their own communities? So for this particular podcast, we have a very exciting speaker. I'm very happy to introduce Mr. Gopal Patel. He is the co-chair of the United Nations Multi-Faith Advisory Council and also directs the Bhumi Project at Oxford University. And it's a great pleasure to have you, Gopal. Thanks for coming here and talking to us. It would be great if you can also introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Radhika. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. So as you mentioned, I serve as the co-chair of the UN's Faith Advisory Council and also as director of a faith-based program called the Bhumi Project, which works mainly with Hindu groups internationally on the SDGs. And my background is that I used to be a Hindu monk for several years. I lived as a monk in India for a year on the banks of the Ganges, and then I moved to London and lived in an ashram in London. And then when I left that world, a colleague of mine, a friend, asked if I would help set up a Hindu faith-based project working on climate change and sustainability. And so I've been doing this work now for about 10 years and working with Hindu groups and other faith-based organizations internationally on addressing these, critical concerns around climate change, biodiversity loss, wildlife conservation, and other concerns around the SDGs. So that's kind of a little bit of who I am and what I've been doing.
Very, very exciting, Gopal. And I must say that I have not really met or interviewed a person who is a Hindu monk as well as who does sustainability. So I think this is really perfect to hear more from you and to get inspired. So basically, what led you to this work on sustainability in the first place? And tell us more about this Bhumi project that you're involved with and your work at the UN.
Sure. So like I said, I fell into this work to a certain extent that I was living as a monk and I was looking for a job, essentially, and my colleague and friend who was and still is the founder director of the Center for Hindu Studies at Oxford University, he asked if I would help lead this program. This was back in 2009. And so that's kind of how I got into it. And really, in essence, what kind of keeps me going in this work and the reason I do this work is that, the faiths of the world provide frameworks by which we should live our lives. And the framework that I got by living as a monk and studying Hindu text really could be applied to various spheres of life, from business to family life to charitable work to development work. And so I come to this work around sustainable development really through the lens of faith, but that lens can be applied in so many different ways. And so the work we do is really, how do we mobilize people to act for the betterment of the world? And we know that people are moved into action for various reasons, for financial reasons or for economic or business reasons or political reasons. But we know that estimates say that about 80% of the world's population belongs to a faith tradition. And so it kind of makes sense to speak to people through the lens and through the language of the faiths. And so that's what we try to do with the Bhumi Project, is speak to Hindu groups internationally using Hindu teachings and values and principles around sustainable development so that they move into action and lead more sustainable lifestyles. And then the work we're doing with the United Nations is that we have a Faith Advisory Council made up of 40 what we call faith-based organizations, FBOs. And we're there to advise the UN on how to work with the faiths. Because the UN has worked with the faiths for many years. They have a interagency task force on faith, on religion and development. But the UN is not a faith organization. It's a development organization, humanitarian organization. And so we exist as the Advisory Council to advise the UN how do you talk to the faiths? What can you say? What shouldn't you say? What are the touch points? What are the sensitivities? What are the things the faith will be willing to do? What are the things that they may not be willing to do? And so our role at the UN in terms of the Advisory Council is really advise the UN on how best to mobilize the faiths to realize their sustainable development goals.
It's very, very fascinating, and you bring up very important issues which for us it's new, because we are tackling with development issues, we are tackling with spirituality now. How do these two interact? And this seems to be like a new area for us, because generally we see development as development practitioners doing other things. As you mentioned, UN would do their own thing. And then the spiritual people have their own spiritual agenda where they are focusing on more on well-being. So this collective action that you're talking about, how do you connect this to sustainability? If you can give us few examples, I think that would be great.
Okay, let me see. Well, I will say that, really, when we talk about sustainability, in essence, what we're talking about is what is the relationship between humanity and the world and the natural world. And we've decided that we should live in a way, that humanity should live in a way which is sustainable. We're not saying that we want to live in an exploitative way or an extractive way or a harmful way. We want to live in a sustainable way. And that's the word. And that's the framing by which the SDGs are there. And that's the framing that we use for sustainable development, that we have to live and develop in a sustainable way. In one sense, that's kind of redundant. Of course, development should be sustainable. But we know in the past, development hasn't been sustainable. And so that's why we preface it now by saying, no, the development has to be sustainable. And that's not so different from how the faiths operate. Sustainability is a framework. It's a value system. And the faiths and spirituality is also a value system. In essence, what you're looking at is, if you really boil it down, if you take out the theology of the faiths and rituals and so on like that, what you end up is with stories. The faiths are really compelling stories, and people buy into those stories. And then they buy into those stories, and then they buy into the values that the stories advocate for. And in the same way, when we talk about sustainability is a story of our time. We are saying that we want to live in a sustainable way, and therefore sustainability is advocating for certain values. And so people are buying into those values because they buy into the story. And so there is not so much difference between the faiths and the world of sustainable development if you take out the God component. In essence, they're exactly the same. They're about a story that we're telling ourselves, that we tell ourselves about the world, and that we see ourselves in, and so we can operate in a way where we feel that we're in community with each other and the wider world.
Mm-hmm. So you are basically saying that there is a common platform across all religions that can help to foster sustainability. Is that right? And how do you bring in the every religion has their own uniqueness, and how is there conflict between the two, between different religions that you see, or are you basically saying that there is a common principle that guides all religion, and that principle relates to sustainability in a much more interconnected way?
I would say that from my work and my research is that the faiths are different, and it would be harmful to say that the faiths are the same. We have to recognize that just as different countries are different models of politics are different, different models of governance and economic models are different models of religion are different as well. And we have to embrace that diversity. We kind of live in a world where diversity, although we say we advocate for diversity, oftentimes we want everything to be the same. And the faiths are diverse, but there's commonality as well. Like I said, they all have these very compelling stories which oftentimes transcend thousands of years. They transcend generations, and they transcend geographies as well, and peoples. And so there are differences in the faiths, but they all have their compelling ways of talking about the world and the ways in which people should live. So, for example, if I take a couple of examples within Christian traditions, they will often talk about being stewards of the earth. And that they take that straight out of the Bible, and they see themselves as we are the stewards. Now that has theological connotations to it, but it also has very real development connotations to it as well. Stewardship, to a certain extent, implies ownership, or it implies hierarchy. Okay. Now there's nothing inherently wrong with ownership or hierarchy, but if it's used in an exploitative way, then it's bad, right? And we see, and scholars have said that part of the reason we're living in an unsustainable world is because our development models have come out of mainly Christian Abrahamic worldviews, which frame a separation between man or humanity and nature, that separate the two artificially, because humans are stewards of nature. Humans are living beings, and nature is inert matter to be controlled and used by humanity. Now, if you go to the Eastern traditions, where I have a bit more experience in speaking from a Hindu or a Dharmic perspective, that worldview is much more interconnected. If you look at the Bhagavad Gita, which is a primary Hindu text, it talks very clearly about the equality of all life, that the value of an animal and a human and a plant from the spiritual perspective is exactly the same. So when you enter and live in a world where everything is equal, the desire to exploit or the desire to harm decreases. So that those are very two stark differences from a Christian worldview and a Dharmic Hindu worldview. But there's overlap as well. And there's a recognition that no worldview is inherently wrong, it's how it's applied.
Mm-hmm. That's very, very fascinating. In fact, I just wanted to add on the Christianity side of things that Pope recently, under the leadership of Jeffrey Sachs, has convened this meeting called the Ethics in Action Group. And I was lucky enough to be in Rome to discuss the education component. And I thought it will be a very spiritual or a Catholic guided meeting, but he had invited all sorts of different religions, and it was very fascinating to see. It was on education, but it was very fascinating to see how everyone basically said that education is the driving force and there should be more on education, and how education is the conduit for peace. In your through your reading, and of course you have a much more in-depth knowledge on Hinduism, do you feel that education for sustainability could be a way where we can promote the idea of sustainability, or do you think that education should be very non-traditional? We can do it in the temples, we can do it in the communities, or what role do you see school playing in this sphere?
Vitally important. The education for sustainability is the primary thing I would say that we need to be inculcating in young people and children across the world. And just to step back, statistics show that all the faiths of the world founded or run 50% of all the schools in the world. So, and then you look at faiths are also the third largest investing block in the world, and the faiths, the amount of property that the faiths have. So there's significant economic power that the faiths have. And so when talking about education, 50% of all schools is not an insignificant number of schools. So definitely we need to develop the curriculum and training programs for school children in faith education and outside as well to talk about sustainability. That's definitely needed. But it has to go hand in hand, which is what I'm calling now is like a broad and grand narrative. We need a bigger narrative. It's almost disempowering sometimes to talk about sustainability when people see that there's no likelihood of them getting a job, or they know that climate change is really going to devastate their country, or that the political system is collapsing. And so there needs to be a revival. There needs to be this grand narrative of what is the purpose of life? What is my meaning? And within that, sustainability can fit very nicely. But sustainability on its own, without being connected to what the concerns are of that country, of the people in that region, won't be as effective.
Mm-hmm. When I think of sustainability, it doesn't lend me to think about religion. Or should I separate religion, spirituality, and sustainability and secularism? There is this conflict where I link sustainability to a particular religion, Hinduism, because then I am overloading things with, maybe not everyone can believe in those concepts because they are not familiar with it. So how can we, I don't know if there is a distinction where we can make that you focus more on spirituality, where everyone can be linked to various religions, and we are saying that spirituality and sustainability are linked together, or do you want to still go with religious education and linked it to sustainability?
Like I said at the beginning, for me, I view sustainability as one of the narratives, one of the ways that we have agreed upon in the world that we want to live. And so therefore, if that's what, not everyone agrees with that, but if that's what we agree upon, then, the values intersect all the different kind of things that you're talking about: religion, spirituality, secular countries and non-secular countries. And so it's not so much about breaking it down, but it's more about, how do I talk about the values of sustainability in a way that people in different audiences will understand. So there's not like a Hindu version of sustainability and then a Muslim version of sustainability and a secular. They all talk about living in harmony. They all talk about living in balance. They all talk about caring for the poor, lifting up people, gender equality. These are there in all the faiths. And it's more about finding out, how do I talk about these issues in a way that these different people from these different audiences will understand. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you're basically trying to take away the rituals, take away the religious component, and say that there are all these common principles, and all these common principles are driving towards sustainability. Right. So it is basically utilizing spirituality for the greater common good, and we should basically not be selfish and greedy as human beings, and see what we can do for ourselves and for our community. That leads to my second question, my other question, which is about this general idea of greed and all more is better, and the idea of convenience that is destroying the sustainability pattern of the earth. What does religion and what does spirituality tell us about these concepts?
Yeah, well, the first thing it says is greed is not good. I think, all the faith, well, as far as I understand, all the faiths, or the majority of the faiths, have this sense that greed is not good. Over accumulation of anything is not good. And definitely in the Eastern traditions, and I'm sure in other traditions as well, there's this sense of self-restraint, of self-control. In the Sanskrit is tapas or tapasya, where you voluntarily reduce your needs and your desires. There's a famous quote by Mahatma Gandhi where he says, there is enough for every man's need, but not for one man's greed. And he took that saying from the Isha Upanishad, which is the first of the Upanishadic texts in Hinduism, where the first verse says that everything is owned and controlled by God, and that an individual should only take what they need and not take from someone else because it doesn't belong to them. And we live in a society where, unfortunately, that is not the norm anymore, that for some reason, humankind over-accumulates. For example, if we take the example of, if there was a pile of rice, insects would come and they would take only the rice that they would need to eat for that day or for that week or something like that. If there's a pile of rice, the human will come and take all the rice, even if they're not going to eat it, just because they thought, oh, here's something for free, let me take it. And so all the faiths have these value systems about not over-accumulating, not being greedy, and again, by living in balance and harmony with the natural world. And so I think, that's such an important and powerful message. And in essence, sustainability is trying to speak to that same message in very secular, non-spiritual, economic language. And it's having success. Now we're seeing people out there recognizing that they don't need to buy an extra car, or they don't need to fly on vacation, or they don't need to, do whatever. And so the message is percolating throughout society now that we need to live in sustainable ways. There's certainly much more we need to talk about when it comes to sustainability. But the message is certainly getting out there. And so the faiths have been talking about that for thousands of years. And modernity, capitalism was built out of a system of greed was good. And we're recognizing the limitations of that. And we see that on a personal level. We know that studies have shown that when personal incomes reach a certain level, your happiness actually doesn't keep increasing. I think it's like $60,000 or something like that. Beyond that, one's level of happiness doesn't exponentially increase. And so we know that to be happy, we need to have less. The desire, the ichcha in Sanskrit, the desire to have more is actually considered a source of suffering. The Bhagavad Gita again says that one is happy who is self-restrained, who is self-controlled. To have unlimited desires is actually the root cause of unhappiness in the world.
So if, as you just mentioned, that the texts, Hindu texts, have been suggesting the same thing over and over millions of years, why are we still in this problem where we are destroying our own earth? And why is it, and also my second question is it because the religions have become much more ritualistic and we have forgotten the essence of connecting the scriptures to our current day needs? Is that what is needed? Or is it just the religion is not really, it's become redundant in some ways and we are on our own, there is no radar, there is nothing controlling us, and so basically we are kind of on this exploitation mission?
I would say that, notice that I'm talking about the Hindu texts. I'm not saying about Hindu people. The texts say one thing, the practitioners say and do something else, and that's the case for all the traditions. But I would say the religion of the world is capitalism. The religion of the world is unlimited economic growth. And that's the religion that everyone has bought into, and even the religions have bought into. And the religions have profited in various ways from buying into the capitalist system. Now, I'm not saying that we have to do away with capitalism. That's not my argument. That's not my point. My point is that that's the model that we've all bought into. And now sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals are saying, okay, we still need to have capitalism, we still need to have economic growth, but we need to do it in a sustainable way. Now, I'm not sure if that's the answer, but it's certainly a good step in the right direction. And so the reason the faiths, don't fully live out what's in their scripture is because it's not because they're unwilling to. It's more because it's just a circumstance of the world that they're operating in. Again, going to Mahatma Gandhi, when he was doing his experiments in poverty and and different things, he would joke that he would say that his friends would say that it costs them more money to keep him in poverty. Because to live in poverty is actually very difficult these days. To live a life of simplicity is actually very difficult, especially in the Western world. And so the faiths have had to adopt a Western capitalist system in order just to survive as the faiths, as faith institutions. And so to go against that grain is very difficult. But where the faiths can add value and where they are trying to add value is to speak to our current systems of economics and so on, and interject with faith values. So, for example, we're working on a major program called Faith Invest, which is what does finance and what does investment look like from a faith perspective. So we authored Hindu investment guidelines. There are Muslim investment guidelines and Jewish and Buddhist and other traditions as well. So because a big part of the SDGs is mobilizing money in order to realize the SDGs. But we want to get the faiths involved because the faiths have a lot of money. But they all invest according to their values. And so, the faiths are trying to involve themselves in this grand conversation around what is the purpose of life from a non-religious perspective. So, there's partly blame on the faiths, but it's just a circumstantial thing where they've just had to get with the program to a certain extent and just accept that this is the reality. And they don't have the level of control or ownership over countries and people in the way that they may have done hundreds, if not thousands of years ago.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for bringing that macro picture. I want to ask you about community-based activities now. So in our previous conversations, you've mentioned that you have spoken to Hindu priests and in Hindu temples, and so we wanted to know more about that and what were some of the successes and what were some of the failures of your work.
Sure. So for a number of years, we worked extensively, mainly across North India, and we worked with some of the major temple towns, like pilgrimage towns, such as Varanasi and Vrindavan and Rishikesh and Puri, Dwarka and Abu and places like that, mainly in the north. And we did great work around what we called we produced a resource called the Green Temple Guide, and it was looking at how temples in India can be more environmentally friendly and sustainable. And we worked with over 30 temples to develop that resource. And we worked with the biggest temples. For example, one year we had a big campaign in Varanasi. We had a program called Hindu Environment Week, and all across the town were our posters, and people were coming out to clean the city. One year in Puri, one of my favorite pilgrimage places in India, again for Hindu Environment Week, we had so many volunteers coming out to help that we had to turn them away. They were coming out to clean the temple. There's these tanks, these water tanks that temples have in India, clean the temple tanks and the streets and so on. So we had significant impact with that. And then we also, with other organizations, worked around protecting of wildlife in India, because a lot of the tiger reserves in India have temples inside them. And so pilgrims were going to the temples, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims over a couple of days sometimes, and causing mass disruption to the tigers and the wildlife there. And so we worked with temple authorities and forest conservation groups to minimize religious impact, religious pilgrimage on tigers. And so we had a great impact there. And so we did really groundbreaking work, I would say, and some work with Hindu temples and solar energy and so on. I would say the biggest challenge that we've had, or the failures as you framed it, is really just we didn't build in. The programs weren't sustainable. To be speaking to the theme of today, we didn't build in a way that these programs could continue without our continued involvement and financial support. And that was a lesson for us, that we can go in and we can generate energy and get people mobilized and get people out on the streets. But if you don't build in a way that it's financially sustainable, or that it's sustainable in a way that people take ownership of it, once you step away, that program will fall apart. And so that's very important, the local stakeholder buy-in, ensuring that people take responsibility for programs when you move into a place. I think that was our biggest learning and biggest challenge from that work.
Thank you, Gopal. I think our interview can go on and on, because it has been just very fascinating to hear from you, and I think these are very new aspects for me. But just to conclude our interview, I want to ask you one final question about people like me who go to temples and to churches. How can we bring in sustainability through our religion, and what can we do in our small ways to promote sustainability through our religion?
So for yourself, if you're going to a church or a temple in New Jersey or New York City or wherever you may be, it's simple things like we can just go in and we can see, okay, what is our place of worship doing? Are they composting their food waste? Are they using renewable energy? Are they using plastic cutlery and plates that a lot of Hindu temples do? So we can just go in and observe initially, and if we see something that we feel we want to make a difference on, then we can maybe speak to the priest or the clergy or the director of the place of worship and say, can we have a conversation? They may be interested, and if there's interest, then maybe we organize a workshop or something like that. Maybe develop a green committee or a green team for our place of worship. That's if the leadership are supportive. If they're not supportive, then the other tactic is to do some guerrilla tactics. So if the temple is using plastics and you don't want to, then every Sunday when you go to the temple, take your own plate and get your friends and family to take their own plates as well, and kind of quietly have some civil disobedience in Gandhi's way, and say, you know what, I'm not going to use your plastics, I'm going to use my own steel plates and my cups and things like that, and find ways to kind of, what they say, lovingly agitate the leadership so they take notice of you. Because otherwise they'll think if they just say no, they'll think you're all talk. But if you start doing something, then they'll be like, okay, we can't ignore this person anymore. So, first speak to the leadership. If that doesn't work, then find ways to kind of be seen and be noticed by the leadership.
Lovingly agitate. Okay, so I'm going to remember that and hopefully try to bring change. And thanks for this interview, because it's given me personally this area of work where I always thought that these are two different worlds. I go to church and I go to a Hindu temple, and that's where I pray. My sustainability element is somewhere else, and I didn't really see the connection. So thanks for bringing this entire feel come together, and these are two really important aspects of our lives that we need to bring together. And hopefully through your work, and we're not going to leave you so easily, because we'll continue to keep talking to you and asking you to come to various places to explain the scriptures. I think this is also very important, that sometimes we need that person who has extensive knowledge about the scriptures to tell us how can we link our current lives and our challenges towards the practices and towards what is written in our religious textbooks. So thank you, Gopal, for this fascinating discussion, and it's really been a pleasure.
Thank you.
For more on this series, please visit and contact Dr. Radhika Iyengar and Hein Shin at ed4sd.org, ed4sd.org.